Shortly after this photo was taken, these climbers found themselves caught in a death trap. And ironically, it had nothing to do with the deadly height that they were hanging from. You see, as these climbers rested in their portaledge, suspended over 1,000 feet off of the ground, by the way, bullets began to pierce the rock wall all around them. They were completely helpless, and little did they know that this would mark the start of a nightmare so shocking that there's actually some people out there that refuse to believe it's true to this day. But folks, the thing is, this story is true. Every single imaginable threat that could possibly kill a human being was about to be unleashed on these climbers. I'm talking war, starvation, freezing temperatures, I mean, you name it. And as their situation got worse and worse and worse, the climbers were forced to confront the most important decision of their lives. They either had to accept death, or they had to pay the price to survive. I feel like I say this a lot, but this is honestly probably the most unique story that I've ever covered on my channel. And frankly, it's just very morbidly fascinating. I mean, let's be honest, that's why a lot of us are here in the first place. But I do just want you to remember that these are real people that experienced real horror and trauma, especially when you find out what they did at the end of the story. And so please just show these people the utmost amount of compassion and respect. And with that said, let's take a virtual trip right now together to the country of Kyrgyzstan. Now, this trip is totally free, but you have to hit that subscribe button to cover your admission, especially if you are a repeat viewer. There's literally thousands of you that watch all of my videos, or a lot of them, but aren't subscribed yet. So if that's you, please do it. Okay, so Kyrgyzstan is home to endless beautiful mountains and a lot of climbing routes. And of course, it's for that reason that in the year 2000, 4 young climbers, who were all very eager to prove themselves, began a months-long expedition in the southern region of the country. The climbers were 25-year-old John Dickey, 22-year-old Jason Smith, 20-year-old Beth Rodden, and her then boyfriend, 22-year-old Tommy Caldwell. Now, if the last 2 names I just said there sound familiar to you, it's probably because Beth and Tommy are both considered some of the best climbers ever, and they've been featured in tons of popular documentaries over the years, so there's a good chance that you've heard of them before. But it's important to know that all 4 of these climbers were rising stars in the community back in the early 2000s. In fact, this particular expedition to Kyrgyzstan was partially sponsored by the North Face, and these climbers hoped to spend a few weeks exploring this new and remote country, maybe climbing a few routes for the very first time in history before returning to the US with bigger climbing resumes, certainly, but also epic photos and just a lot of good stories. On August 11th, 2000, the group of 4 spent their very first night on what is known as the Yellow Wall. And it was actually Tommy's 22nd birthday. And so, suspended in their portaledges over 1,000 feet from the ground, Beth sang her boyfriend happy birthday before they all settled in for the night, excited to wake up the very next morning and continue exploring. But instead of doing this, they would end up waking up to literal gunfire. Like, you heard that right. On Tommy's very first morning as a 22-year-old, himself and the rest of his group were getting shot at. I mean, can you imagine this? You're hanging in this makeshift tent 1,000 feet in the air, and all of a sudden there's bullets pounding the wall behind you. You're a total sitting duck, right? And the group, they peered down to the ground below, and they saw 3 men kind of waving at them, 3 armed men, telling them to come down. Now, rappelling down to 3 men that were shooting at you was just about the last thing that the 4 climbers wanted to do, obviously. But I mean, what choice did they have? John actually volunteered to go down first, quite courageously volunteered, I might add, with his plan being to offer these men a pack of cigarettes. I mean, maybe that would kind of break the tension. Like, what else were they really supposed to do? The group hoped that John could quickly defuse the situation. I mean, they were literally getting shot at just 3 seconds earlier, but unfortunately, that was not going to happen. In fact, the group's nightmare was actually just getting started. They were now on a track that was taking them towards pretty much the most horrifying conclusion possible, but we'll get there. First, however, I need to kind of bring the temperature down a bit. I mean, that's some pretty heavy stuff there. And yeah, we're about to get into some really disturbing details. And so before we do that, I just want to lighten the mood for a moment and tell you about Drink Element. Now, I'm not a climber, but I am a hiker. And one thing that happens to me pretty much every time I go hiking is I sweat. And I've had times on trail before where even though I'm drinking a bunch of water, I just don't feel right. Like I'm getting muscle cramps, I'm getting fatigued. And so this is where Drink Element comes in. Ever since I found Element, I haven't had these problems anymore because I slam that stuff when I'm on trail or when I'm just doing anything that makes me sweat. Element has the best flavors you've ever heard of. Citrus salt is probably my favorite. Grapefruit salt's up there. What you need to do is go to drinkelement.com/KyleHatesHiking. That's drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking, or click the link right at the top of the description. And when you make a purchase through my link, you're gonna get a sample pack of 8 additional Element flavors thrown in with your order for no extra cost. That's a really good deal. So one more time, drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking, or click that link at the top of the description. Thank you so much to Element. All right, let's get back to the story. So John spends 25 painstaking minutes rappelling down to meet these armed men. And when he finally reaches them, he offers this pack of cigarettes. But unfortunately, the men were not interested. Instead, they communicate through hand gestures and broken English. They basically communicate that they would like to visit the climbers' base camp, which is located about a mile's hike away. John would nervously radio back up to his fellow climbers who were still up on the portaledge, telling them that they needed to come down. It still wasn't clear exactly what was going on, but at this point it was crystal clear to the group that they were essentially being kidnapped. As Tommy, Beth, and Jason began making their way down the wall, climbing down slowly, their heads were spinning with questions. I mean, probably many of the same questions that you're wondering about right now. Questions like, who were these men? Why were they taking the 4 Americans hostage? And probably most importantly, what was going to happen to the Americans next? And I don't have an answer for all those questions, but I do have an answer for the first one. It would turn out that the climbers had been taken captive by a group of Islamic rebels known as the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, or IMU for short. And so as these rebels led the climbers on the hike back to their base camp, the climbers were actually able to learn a little bit more about them. So the first man's name was Abdul, and he appeared to be calling the shots, like he was the leader, if you will. And then the other 2 men were named Obert and Sue, respectively. Now, despite the fact that these men were armed and clearly kidnapping the young climbers, they weren't like behaving aggressively either. I mean, let me try to explain. Like they weren't yelling. They weren't like shoving their weapons in the group's faces. They weren't even laying their hands on them at all, for that matter. They had this bizarre calmness about them. And Sue in particular even seemed kind of friendly with the climbers. Their demeanor certainly added to the confusion of the situation, as did what the climbers saw when they returned to their base camp. When John, Jason, Beth, and Tommy arrived at what used to be their camp, they found it completely ransacked. And they also found a 4th man at their campsite, and this man actually looked kind of familiar. As it would turn out, this man was not a member of the IMU, but was rather another one of their hostages. His name was Turret. I think that's how you pronounce that. I apologize if I get his name wrong. And this gentleman was actually a member of the Kyrgyz army. The climbers had met him a few days earlier when they were kind of making their trek in. And while it was nice to see a familiar face, unfortunately, Turret had nothing but bad news to share. That's actually a bit of an understatement, to be honest. He basically told the young climbers that the rebels had killed a number of his fellow soldiers. I mean, their blood was literally still freshly displayed on his clothing. And He told them that the rebels were basically holding him hostage so that he could help guide them through the remote mountain terrain. That's pretty much the only reason he hadn't been killed as well. And so all of the hostages were then ordered to pack up what was left of their base camp, presumably to go on some sort of trek. And they had pretty much just about finished this task when all of a sudden something happened that changed the rebels' demeanor from calm to vicious, pretty much in the blink of an eye. A helicopter, presumably from the Kyrgyz army, roared overhead. Abdul started to scream in broken English, and though his words weren't really clear, his message certainly was. And of course, the message was, take cover right now, and if you're responsible for the helicopter seeing us, then well, you're dead. There was good and bad news for John, Jason, Beth, and Tommy at this point. The good news was that the helicopter passed by without noticing them, and so nobody was guilty of blowing their cover. But the bad news was that this would not be the only time that a government helicopter would fly overhead. And to make matters worse, Turret informed the group that Kyrgyz army soldiers were actively hunting for the rebels in this valley, and basically that a firefight was imminent. I mean, it wasn't a matter of if bullets started flying, it was a matter of when. Which is just insane if you think about it. I mean, it's somehow what had started out as this like once in a lifetime climbing trip for a bunch of young, blissful Americans had devolved into a war. I mean, just let that sit in for a second. The rebels and their captives left the base camp behind, carrying as much equipment and food as they could, and they presumably began marching north towards the border with Uzbekistan, at least according to Turret's hunch. They dodged more helicopters and government soldiers that were patrolling, and by the afternoon, there was just a lot of tension. Pretty much everybody realized that something was about to pop off. Beth and Tommy were mortified, thinking that their lives were about to come to an end. John and Jason were basically in survival mode, thinking about how they could potentially kill their captors and escape. And then there's Turret, who was in a whole world of his own, insisting that the rebels were going to kill him as soon as a firefight broke out, and he was basically just trying his best to come to peace with his inevitable fate. Around 3 p.m., the rebel fighters set off this hasty ambush on a group of Kyrgyz fighters coming up the valley, and almost immediately, the young American climbers watched in horror as multiple soldiers were killed instantly. The group of hostages quickly ducked behind a large rock, deeming it the safest possible place to wait out the action, but one of them wouldn't remain there for very long. As the gunfight intensified, Abdul suddenly confronted the group and asked Turret to come with him. He took him away, and then pretty much everyone knew what was going to happen next. Turret was taken out of sight, brought behind a different rock, and then 2 quick gunshots were heard. And then, pretty soon after that, Abdul forced the rest of the hostages, the American climbers, to move behind that very same boulder in an effort to start retreating from the battle. And so now they're all crowded behind the same boulder where Turret was just shot, and his lifeless body is kind of just sitting there. And so they're trying not to look at it, of course, but I mean, it was kind of necessary to shelter themselves, and so they really had no choice but to just kind of crouch down right next to it. I mean, just brutal stuff. And so by nightfall, there was still no clear winner of this battle. And it's at this point that Abdul decided the group needed to move on for whatever reason. And so they lightened their loads as much as they possibly could. They basically just grabbed a small amount of food and then began kind of snaking their way up the mountains, dodging the occasional gunshot. The group would trek all the way until the early morning of August 13th. I mean, they basically hiked until they couldn't walk anymore. They then spent the next 16 plus hours hiding out in a few tiny caves, kind of sandwiched in there body to body with their captors, until finally night set in again and Abdul decided that it was time to get moving again. By this point, there were only 2 rebels guiding the climbers, if you will. Abdul, of course, the vicious leader, and then this other man, Sue, who had clearly taken kind of a liking to the Americans. The first thing that the group needed to do once they got moving again was cross this raging river. They wanted to kind of make their way up into the hills on the other side of it, but the problem was that the river was just too wide and too just raging for them to cross it on foot. And so Abdul and Sue kind of struggled to put in place like a makeshift bridge by like tossing a log across the river. But when they did this, the log only made it about halfway across and it basically got stuck. And so Abdul and Sue are kind of like scrambling, searching for a solution, when all of a sudden, Jason just kind of sprang into action. I mean, you have to remember that the 4 American climbers, while they were young, they were extremely comfortable and experienced in the outdoors. Crossing dangerous rivers was something that they had all done plenty of times before. And so Jason decided to utilize his skills in this moment, much to the surprise of Tommy, Beth, and John. Jason risked his life and jumped into the river, fighting the current with every step until he was finally able to kind of push that log the rest of the way across the river, completing this makeshift bridge. Even the rebels tried to stop him, telling him that it was too dangerous, but he didn't listen and he was successful. And so the group then crossed this precarious log one by one until finally it was Abdul's turn. In a very ironic twist, Abdul actually seemed more nervous about crossing this raging river than he did about the gun battle that he had been in the previous day. And Jason, recognizing Abdul's nervousness, actually kind of extended a hand, offering to help him as he made his way across the slippery log. Shockingly, instead of taking Jason's hand, to help him balance, Abdul actually handed him his rifle. And so for a brief moment, the automatic weapon was now in the hands of the climbers. I mean, it all happened so fast, right? Even too fast, you could say. Abdul quickly crossed the log, and before anyone really had time to think about it, the weapon, well, it was back in Abdul's hands. But even though the rebels were now back in control, this river crossing was really a massive turning point for the American climbers. They realized 2 very important things. First of all, they realized that Abdul and Sue were not as comfortable or skilled in the mountains as they were. I mean, this river crossing was a clear example of that. And this is something that the climbers might be able to use to escape at some point. And second of all, the climbers realized that Abdul and Sue were beginning to trust them. Why else would Abdul have handed his gun over, even just for a moment? I mean, that's crazy, right? And so maybe if the climbers worked to stay on the good side of their captors, maybe they might start to trust them a little bit too much, which the climbers could then exploit. They just needed to wait for the perfect opportunity to present itself. The next few days were absolute hell for everyone. Because they had ditched a lot of their food and their gear during the battle on the 12th, the entire group were starving, dehydrated, and freezing cold pretty much every single night. They would move across these cliffs and slopes of the mountains at night, as they didn't want to get detected. They would share what little food they had, which was mostly just leftover protein bars. They would share that stuff with their captors, again, in order to remain on their good side and continue to build that trust. They would even, this is kind of weird, but like cuddle up with Abdul and Sue at night so that they could like all share their body heat and stay warm. Of course, none of the 4 climbers enjoyed this, but at least Sue did seem a little bit thankful. The climbers did their best to just kind of like bury their resentment and to assist their captors and just build that trust in any way possible. And as each day passed by, it became more and more evident that this plan was actually working, especially with Sue. You got to know that Sue was actually a very young kid. He was only about 19 years old, which was actually a little bit younger than the climbers themselves. Abdul, the leader, was a good 10 to 15 years older, right? But Sue's this young kid just like them. And as time went on, Sue began to smile more. They would even joke around with him a little bit. There were moments where it almost seemed like Sue was actually on their side. But, of course, that was an illusion. I mean, Sue was still holding them hostage via an automatic rifle all day, every day, and he was still taking orders from Abdul. And so by day 6 of their captivity, Jason, John, Tommy, and Beth were barely recognizable as the vibrant climbers who'd arrived in the area weeks earlier. They were malnourished, they were completely exhausted, and their bodies had begun breaking down to the point where they could hardly travel more than a few hundred yards per day. And of course, Abdul and Sue were in even worse shape probably, because again, they're not as comfortable traversing this difficult mountain terrain. And to make matters worse, the climbers still didn't really know where they were going. It almost seemed as though Abdul and Sue were kind of just marching them around, and had shifted their focus from reaching a final destination to just kind of simply surviving each passing hour. But on the evening of night 6, Abdul came up with a plan. The 4 American climbers and Sue would go up a mountain, climb nearly 3,000 feet up this really steep slope, up to a predetermined meeting point. Abdul would then go off on his own, and he would go take a detour, grab some more food and some supplies, and then he would climb up the mountain by himself and meet them at their rendezvous point. And so this is what happened. They parted ways with Abdul, and just like that, Sue was now the only person that was left to guard the 4 climbers. Jason and John had been pretty openly discussing the idea of killing their captors ever since the river incident happened a few days earlier. Tommy and Beth, however, they felt differently. And that's not to say that they were staunchly opposed to, using violence. It's just that they couldn't fathom the possibility of killing another human being, even if this is someone who is doing them harm. And even putting that aside, this was obviously extremely risky. I mean, if they tried and failed to kill the rebels, then they themselves would quickly become the ones who were getting killed. I mean, of course they would get turned on. And so all 4 of them were just silently pondering this possibility as they began to make their way up the mountain. And again, though they were tired, for the American climbers, this was a pretty routine task, right? The terrain was challenging, but it was nothing compared to what they had done before. I mean, this is literally what they came to Kyrgyzstan to do in the first place, climb. But for Sue, well, let's just say that he wasn't really much of a climber. That was crystal clear. His movements were clumsy. He struggled to keep up the pace, and he was even relying on Jason most of the time to kind of guide his hand movements, tell him where to put his hands while they climbed up this steep cliff. You have to understand that this is the kind of terrain where a fall would be fatal. I mean, there's just no other way of saying it. And the American climbers were in their element. Sue was not. Sue even slung his rifle over his back so that he could climb more stably, more freely, but this didn't really help. And the more that Sue struggled, the more that the climbers began to kind of toy with the idea of pushing him off the cliff. Like I said a few minutes ago, Jason and John had been kind of waiting for this moment for a long time, but Beth and Tommy were absolutely terrified. I mean, Beth certainly wasn't going to be the one to do it, and Tommy didn't really think that he had it in him either. They're climbing up this steep cliff, but before they knew it, the end was basically in sight. I mean, they had almost reached the top of it. And so if anything was going to happen, it had to happen now. They were running out of time. And so Jason maneuvered himself kind of off to the side of Sue, hoping to get enough leverage to kind of push him straight off the cliff. But Sue unintentionally kind of outmaneuvered Jason. And again, Sue still had no idea about the intentions of the climbers that he was now relying on to make it up the mountain. And so at this point, they can literally see the end of the climb. I mean, there's only a few more feet to go now. And so Jason and John begin to realize that what might have been their best and last opportunity to free themselves had been squandered. But as fate would have it, the next few hours would leave zero time for this type of reflection, because in an instant, everyone gasped, A lot of them screamed, and then all of a sudden, time stood still. Flash forward a few hours later, and Jason, John, Tommy, and Beth were literally diving into a Kyrgyz army outpost building. They were then given fresh food for the first time in days, by the way. They were given water, warm clothing, and pretty much anything else that they could ask for. Against all odds, the climbers had escaped. Their nightmare was over, and they were now completely free. Over the next few days, the government of Kyrgyzstan, as well as the U.S. Embassy, well, they kind of worked together to bring the climbers back to the United States. Cameras and a lot of media attention kind of followed them around everywhere for a while after their return. Once they arrived back home, the climbers clung to their reunion with their family and loved ones, but their nervous looks and demeanor hinted at a very dark truth, a secret that they carried from that final fateful night on the mountain. And eventually, the full story would come out. And when it did, it would shock pretty much everyone. Tommy, the shy, quiet young man who would never hurt anyone, who would never harbor any violence, well, Tommy had done the unthinkable. You see, on that steep climb up the mountain with Sue, at the very top, right before they had almost finished it, Tommy glanced over at Beth, and they silently agreed that it was time to act. And so in a split second, Tommy rushed forward, he grabbed Sue's rifle strap, and he pulled him off the cliff and sent him on a 2,000-foot tumble down into the darkness. That was the last that the climbers ever saw of him. Tommy was immediately distraught after doing this. I mean, he had just taken a life. Like, how could he have done such a thing? But of course, his fellow climbers reassured him. I mean, Tommy's actions were obviously necessary. He had saved all of their lives. And also, for what it's worth, of course, they didn't know this at the time, but Sue actually survived the fall and would later go on to be arrested. And so, Tommy's desperate act, so unlike him, set the climbers free. After this, they climbed back down the mountain and they hiked and hiked and hiked until they reached that government army outpost, at which point they were finally rescued. And yet, despite his courageous act, and despite the fact that it basically saved him, it also opened up the door to years and years of trauma and hardship afterwards, which I think is very important for you all to know. Tommy and Beth would continue their careers and eventually both become household names in the world of climbing. John and Jason would go on to lead more private lives. I didn't really find too much about them, and so I think we need to respect their privacy here. And certainly, I encourage all of you to leave some love for all of them in the comments, and especially to Tommy, I guess I'll say, for acting so courageously and saving the lives of his friends. If you want to learn even more details about this story, as well as learn about the lives of Beth and Tommy, well, I encourage you to check out the following two books, which I have linked in the description. First is Beth's book called A Light Through the Cracks, and second is Tommy's book, which is aptly titled The Push. YouTube seems to think that you'll enjoy watching this video next, and so give it a click, and I hope you enjoy it. I mean, I just really appreciate my subscribers so much. You guys are literally the best audience on YouTube. I'm so blessed, and I'll see you in the next video.